I just want to say I'm very disturbed as we perpetuate the fiction that we live in a meritocracy and that people advance based simply on acumen when we are in the midst of quite literally some very high-profile people who have their children's SAT scores fixed. And things like that have been going on by the powerful and the few for a very long time. Okay, so I want to say thank you, Chairwoman Waters, for your continued leadership, for making sure that this committee stays focused on those issues of care and consequence to the American people. I especially appreciate the frame and the titling of this hearing. Several months ago, when Director Kraninger of CFPB was before this committee, I asked her whether or not we were in the midst of a crisis, and I could not get her on the record to even characterize student loan debt as a crisis, when in fact it is. When we talk about the chokehold of this debt, and I've just spent 6 weeks in district in the Massachusetts 7th hearing from families who are struggling to put food on the table, to pay the rent, to take care of aging parents, to pay for childcare. What does all this mean ultimately? It means that people are alive but not living. This debt is not just choking at our ability to build wealth or our purchasing power. It is quite literally choking people. We had a hearing in Oversight and Reform on trauma, and we learned that suicides are on the rise for many reasons. And one of those reasons is debt despair. So this is choking at the promise of our country, and quite literally, we are losing lives because of the debt that folks are burdened by. So it is a crisis. And for those across the aisle that perhaps think that we are being dramatic, you cannot overstate a $1.6 trillion in debt, crushing close to 45 million borrowers. You cannot describe that as anything less than a crisis. So I thank the chairwoman for her leadership, and for those across the aisle that questioned whether or not this committee is germane to this issue, when you overlay this with discriminatory policies like redlining, and then Ms. Harrington shares with us that 90% of defaults are disproportionately borne by students of color, there's no way that there is not an interconnectedness and an intersectionality from homelessness to housing to many of the issues that this committee tackles. And so this is exactly what we should be addressing as a committee. The facts of this crisis, and again, it is a crisis, require no exaggeration. We are past the point of just paying attention. It's time to act. Madam Chairwoman, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to include a statement from the Student Debt Crisis, a nonprofit organization dedicated to combating this crisis.
Without objection, such is the order.
Thank you. Mr. Farmer, you led the team at the CFPB whose sole responsibility was to watch out for all student loan borrowers and younger consumers. What were some of the trends that you and your team noticed?
So unfortunately, what we see, just like we saw in the mortgage context, was when servicers fail, it hits the most vulnerable borrowers the most. And in the student loan context, these are borrowers of color. So we see now, even holding for constant income, degree attainment, African-American borrowers have double-digit rates of default. And with that in mind, the Bureau announced that we were going to be looking at whether or not student loan servicers and student loan companies were in compliance with the nation's fair lending laws.
During your time there, did the CFPB begin to look into potential discrimination in the student loan servicing industry in violation of the civil rights laws, including the Equal Credit Opportunity Act?
So in April of 2017, the CFPB announced that it would be prioritizing in our supervision work whether or not student loan companies were complying with the laws, the nation's fair lending laws, in particular whether or not borrowers based on their race were more likely to have difficulty getting in an income-driven repayment plan.
Okay, and to your knowledge, has the Bureau continued to look into these issues?
Unfortunately not. Based on your own conversation with Director Kraninger, it appears as if the Bureau has just dropped this work.
Thank you. Madam Chairwoman, I'd like to request unanimous consent to include a letter from civil rights organizations, including the NAACP and the Leadership Conference of Civil and Human Rights, urging the CFPB to look into racial disparities in student loan outcomes and potential discrimination in the loan servicing market.
Without objection, such is the order.
Mr. Farman, our friends across the aisle have mentioned that student loan servicers are supposedly not incentivized to steer borrowers toward forbearance, and that they are not financially incentivized to give borrowers poor or outright incorrect advice. Yet an audit released by the DOE in February of this year found that more than 60% of the department's oversight report contained examples of servicers acting improperly. If our friends across the aisle are correct and loan servicers are not incentivized to make mistakes and give poor advice, then why is this consistently happening?
Because they're wrong. because they are incentivized to give bad advice. They're incentivized to get their call reps off the phone as quick as possible, which we see across the industry, leading to the outcomes we have today.
Thank you.